welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this presentation. Before we begin, I'd just like to do a quick acknowledgement of country. So QUT Invest acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and recognize that these lands have always been places of research, teaching, and learning. We recognize the continued cultural and spiritual connections to country, and QUT Invest acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our communities. And we'd like to welcome you all from the communities that you're joining us from today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Amanda to give an introduction to Frank, and we'll kick off.
Thank you very much, Sam. So on behalf of BEST and also on ANPR, the Research Committee, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming along today, and a huge thank you obviously to Frank for very kindly offering his time and also his cognitive power around this topic. So we're going to be looking at social media data collection and analysis. And as I've said before, when I've had Frank do a presentation last year, one of the things, and I've just pointed out to Frank as well, you know, I feel sorry for Frank because he does fantastic stuff. So he's on my radar for new things that he does and for really interesting things that he does really well. So he's very kindly taken up the challenge again today, and I've been watching where he's been going with some of his social media data and how he's been using this for publication purposes. And I think that we've got a lot to learn from him, and also it's a really interesting way that we're seeing a lot of studies moving towards. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Frank and say a big thank you from behalf of BEST and also from ANPR. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope that I can, to some degree, live up to that. Welcome everybody to my presentation on social media data collection and analysis. A little bit about myself. So I'm currently a senior lecturer in marketing at QUT. I'm also, for a couple of years now, a visiting scholar at Columbia University in the US. So when it isn't COVID, I tend to go there once a year, right? I hold a PhD from UNSW, master's and bachelor's from a university in the Netherlands, and yeah, that's pretty much me, right? One thing that I would like to highlight beforehand was that I was originally asked to give a workshop to only our school's PhD students, and then it got promoted through the BEST Center, and then it got promoted through the Australia-New Zealand Marketing Association. So the number of people attending is a lot more than what I anticipated, right? And I hope you excuse my tone when I kind of address this as something that is relevant for marketers or marketing PhD students, right? So that was the original audience, but I believe that more than just marketing PhD students can take value away from this. To provide you with a brief overview, what we will be talking about today. So we will be talking about social media data collection and analysis, and that's basically, I'll be giving a rough introduction when it comes to how to get data from social media, what to do with it, what you can do with it, and what are perhaps some of the caveats, right? And then in a somewhat more limited and brief fashion, I will provide two examples for how, together with my PhD students, we turned social media data and unstructured textual data specifically into papers, right? So we one of my PhD students, she wrote a paper on variety seeking, right? And we published this year in the Journal of Consumer Psychology, which is a Financial Times 50 journal. And my other PhD student, last year, we published a paper on what makes political tweets go viral, and that was published in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, which is also an A and Q1 journal. Now, let's start with the very basics, perhaps for the first and second year PhD students, right? So why are we doing this? Now, typically transitioning from a PhD student to faculty requires quality journal publications, right? So these days, because of COVID, Business schools have a lot less funding, but they're still pumping out the same number of PhD students, which means that getting a faculty position has become a lot more difficult, and hiring committees can be a lot more selective with regards to the candidate that they can select. Now, what this means in real terms is that these days job candidates are required to publish really quality journals for the job market, right? So this means often A-star or Financial Times 50 publications. Now, top journals, if such as those A-star and FT50 journals, in my experience, they require what we call field data or secondary data, right? So they would like to see that the things that you study happen the way that you say, happen the way that you theorize in the real world, right? But if you walk into a bank and ask for some consumer data, they may not be willing to hand it to you, right? So the question is really, where can we get such secondary data? Where can we get data from the real world? Now, one additional thing to say about this is that the current approach that some of you may be following, where you look at student samples or Amazon Mechanical Turk samples, and you ask people, for instance, how much would you be willing to pay for this chocolate bar, or would you be willing to purchase this chocolate bar? Yes and no, right? This kind of approach has increasingly been called out for not necessarily speaking very well to the real world, at least without any additional real world replications. And that, of course, makes it difficult to publish this work. And it makes also reviewers, it makes them likely to ask for 6, 7, 8, or 9 studies, even when the journal you're intending to publish in isn't necessarily very well ranked, right? So this kind of secondary social media data that I will be talking about is helpful in that it can provide you with some degree of advantage. Now, the sources that I have used so far predominantly, they include 3 sources. So there's Kaggle, right? Kaggle is basically data repository where you can, through point and click, basically download data sets, right? Then data sets about all types of things, but they also happen to have data sets about consumer relevant phenomena, right? So in the past, I've found data sets there about hotels, or I've found data sets about bakeries, right? And some of those are turned into papers. The disadvantage with that is that it may be difficult to fit into journal interests, right? So you may find certain correlations in the field data that you have there, but the question is really whether the journal is interested in the specific thing that you found there. And the data is really not amendable at all to any change in research question, right? So you have a data set, you can either write a paper about it or not, but you do not have necessarily a whole lot of freedom when it comes to deciding on your topic. The second source is Twitter, right? So Twitter provides vast amounts of publicly accessible consumer data. It's really, really great. So you can look at individual Twitter accounts and download anything, for instance, that the US Republicans or the US Democrats have ever said, right? Or you can look at hashtags and see what consumers have to say, for instance, about specific car brands, right? The disadvantage with this is that Twitter requires to some degree savviness when it comes to programming, right? So you need to at least be able to download and operate an R and be able to access the Twitter API so that you can basically download the data set. You don't just go to Twitter and say which hashtags you like, how many tweets, and you download the data set. It's not as simple as that. Now, the third data set that I would like to, or the third source that I would like to talk about is called CrowdTangle. So this is perhaps less well known. It is a platform to access Facebook data. And the advantage is, again, that you can have vast amounts of publicly accessible consumer data via point and click, right? So you cannot see what necessarily what Amanda posted on her Facebook page yesterday, but you can see what specific brands that have a public profile, such as, for instance, Mercedes-Benz or Volvo cars, what they posted on their accounts, and you can see how consumers reacted to it in terms of the emoji, in terms of the likes, shares, and the number of comments, but not necessarily their contents. The only disadvantage that I see with this data source is that it may discontinue soon, right? So there have been a number of news articles that suggest that CrowdTangle may not be around for a while. So if you want to have Facebook data, you may want to be quick about this, right? And of course, with all of these three data sources, it's important to mention that this is by no means an exclusive or an all-encompassing review, right? There's many other sources where you can get data from. You can get data from Kickstarter. You can have review data, such as from Amazon, right? And there's many other technologies that you can use to get data from social media and other sources. Now, I may have a bit of a bias towards Facebook data from CrowdTangle. And as a consequence to how user-friendly it is and how useful I believe it is, I would like to briefly show you how you go about it, right? So this slide, once you have access to CrowdTangle, once you're on the platform, it's really this stream of clicks that I'm following here, right? So you go to select historical data in the settings, right? You select specific pages that you would like, and then you select specific dates. You can only ever export about 5 years worth of data. So say, for instance, everything that say the Financial Times has said in the last 5 years, and then you fetch the history, right? So 2022 to 2017, and then after that you can fetch 2017 to 2012. So the limitations really is really not that dramatic, right? With any account that you want to have a look at first, it makes sense to actually go to the Facebook page and see how often have they posted, how many posts do they have, right? Is the last post 3 years ago and the page is 5 years old? That would indicate that perhaps they're not that active and you don't get that many observations, right? So these kind of things are important and useful to consider. But the data will tell you by itself also if there's an issue. So there's often a lot of trial and error involved, and you can't just say, oh, I want to have this or that brand, but you need to be somewhat flexible with regards to the brands that you're looking for. Now, once you hit that fetch button, they send you an email. That email contains a link, and if you click that link, you get a data set that looks like this. So these are all the different columns, right? So there's many more rows to a data set. The rows will correspond to the number of posts that a Facebook page has made. But you can see here, this is an example of Volkswagen, right? So we have the username, we have when the page was created, how many likes the page had, when the post was made, how many followers it had, when exactly the post was created in terms of the date, but also the exact time, which can be useful depending on research question. You have the exact number of likes, comments, and shares at the time of your export. You have the reactions in terms of love, wow, haha, sad emoji, right? So these are important thing to realize, is that sometimes you can request data that is older than the presence of emoji on Facebook. So you need to be mindful of the fact that you don't analyze emoji in a data set that has observations that are older than 2016, right? Because that's when Facebook introduced emoji. And if you're specifically interested about care emoji, that started in 2019. So all of these things, Facebook won't give you a warning or something. You'll just get the data set, and you'll need to be able to disentangle yourself what problems your data may have. Now, these are all interesting outcome variables. And then we have the URL, right? So this is really handy for cross-checking if everything was exported correctly, right? So you can go back to each and every individual post. You can have the message, and we'll talk a lot more about what you can do with the message, because at first it looks like you only have text, but you can actually derive quantifiable variables from that text. I see that a number of people have posted in the chat, so I'll just
so I think there's only one question at the moment regarding the ethics committee. I was thinking maybe we bank these questions and then at the end I can get you to address those.
That's fine. That's fine. The ethics is actually an advantage of this research method, right? So that came to me as a surprise, but it is actually an advantage. But I'll talk about this in the end. Now you can. I already talked about each of the variables in the Excel data set that you'll get, but you can think about it a little bit in terms of, okay, what does a post look like, and then how does that relate to variables that I could actually have in a scientific model that I could test, right? So the first thing that you may consider is actually your sampling frame, right? So which accounts do you want to look at, right? So you may, for instance, say you are interested in sustainable products, right? And you may want to make a comparison between gas guzzling cars and electric cars, right? So you could download all the posts ever made by Polestar and all the posts ever made by Volvo, make a comparison between the two of them, and you have some degree of meaningful comparison between them, right? So of course there's more differences than just electric and gas car, right? But you can see how if you make multiple of such comparisons, or if you have two more comparable brands, right? Then you could really have something. And the advantage here, for instance, Volvo and Polestar, I chose them deliberately because Polestar is partly owned by Volvo, so they're both, at least in part, from Sweden, right? And that allows for meaningful comparisons. Then the next thing that you can look at is the post time, right? So when was this posted? That can be, through a little bit of different coding, converted into different variables, right? So one thing we've done in the past is we looked at when Republicans versus Democrats in the US were in power, right? So you can look at different legislative periods, right? So the nice thing about this is in our data set, for instance, I believe we went from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. No, we didn't have Biden for the data set, but we went back and forth a couple of times. So so it's not just a before and after, but it's it's multiple time periods that allows for really nice comparisons between U.S. Democrat or U.S. Republican presidencies, right? So there's other ways in which you can think of time, right? You can think of rising or declining sales numbers. You can think of times that correspond to a recession versus economic growth, right? You can think of times that correspond to inflation, right? And all of these can be essentially coded into such data sets by just looking at when they were posted. Another more micro level way of looking at it is that you can look at time of day, right? So you can see whether people in the evening perhaps purchase different types of products or share different types of posts compared to the morning, right? So if you say you download an account that was exclusively in the UK, which is only one time zone, right? So you could derive inferences about whether it's better to post in the morning or in the evening. Then there's the text itself, of course, the message, right? So this can be quantified using dictionaries, right? So you may, for instance, have some previous literature suggesting that the word thing means that the consumer has a certain, or more likely has a certain personality or mind state, right? And the word movement may result in the opposite thing, right? And so these kind of words in the message, they can be using additional software. They can be quantified as additional variables as well. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. Now, likes, comment, and shares, they reflect consumer engagement or any type of engagement, really. And you can see how that's intuitively relevant to a marketing channel, right? So you could also think about the followers or the likes of the page, right, as an interesting outcome variable. And then one thing that I really like about Facebook is that they have these emoji, right? So you can see whether people, for instance, had relatively more surprise emoji for certain types of content or for which kind of accounts, surprise works better than say funny posts, right? So this is again something you can derive from that, and I think it's really useful to model psychological processes. Now, of course, no method is ever perfect, and a lot of people will turn to text data and things that, oh, now I can do all of these things, right? But there's a lot of ambiguity, and there's a lot of limitations that maybe the methods that you're familiar with do not have, right? So the first one that you may be aware of, and maybe need to be aware of, is that if you compare two accounts, there may be multiple things that differ between these two accounts. So it's difficult to say, oh, this one represents this and this one represents that, right? So Polestar and Volvo, for instance, Polestar is a much newer brand, right? So you could also be not looking at the effect of sustainable, but actually just new car brands. So clean comparisons are difficult to come by, and you really need to think very carefully and make subjective judgments about what a clean comparison is, right? And so this is something where in the past I've unexpectedly got rejections from papers, repeated rejections, right? And it's difficult to make the right call. There's post-time confounds. Now, in the past, or on the previous page, I talked a little bit about how nice it was that we had presidencies because they went back and forth, right? It wasn't just in the past, it was all Republicans and then it was all Democrats, right? But many events, they are like one-off, right? And with these one-off events, there may be other things that happen at the same time, right? So for instance, during COVID, a lot of things happened, right? So it wasn't just that there was a global pandemic, but also things changed in the housing market, things changed in the economy, and a lot of things happened. And it's difficult to pinpoint effects that are based on time on individual events without really carefully understanding the implications of that. Then if you look at consumer-generated posts, or posts that are not made by professionally managed page, you can see that consumer-generated comments and shares of consumer-generated texts can actually be ambiguous, right? So in the past, I talked about, okay, if you make a post as a brand and that is shared by consumers, that's typically good, right? But if consumers make a lot of posts about something and then other consumers share that, that can actually be really bad, right? So there's a lot of ambiguity with that. And not all publicity is good publicity, particularly for different contexts, right? So this is something that you need to be aware of. And then you may need to adjust your topic to fit the data, right? So in terms of outcome variables, is if what you're interested in is actual eating behavior, then social media data may not be the place for you, right? So that it's difficult, if not impossible, to find that there. So as a consequence of all of these limitations, it may still be necessary to use established methods such as surveys and experiments on top of social media data in order to satisfy the requirements for really high-ranking journals. Now, I promised I was going to talk a little bit more about this message field that you get when you download Facebook data, right? So you can perform text analysis on this, and you can use R for this, which requires the writing of codes, and you have many options to manipulate data, but not necessarily everybody will be able to develop good skills with R coding. And some people, they may just want to have a quick data set to get a quick publication, right? And for those kind of people, LIWC, Linguistic Inquiry Word Count, or it's called LUC, may be a more user-friendly option, right? So this is a software that until recently you could purchase it for $200. You got a lifetime license. I think now that's for 1 year. But either way, you can point and click, and through simply pointing and clicking, you can code variables into textual data sets, right? Now, for text analysis, there's great resources, and I think there's experts that build their entire career just on introducing and improving the method of text analysis. And as a starting point, I could use this reference here. And there's also great instruments. So personally have somewhat of a bias towards the regulatory mode dictionary, right? There's a dictionary that allows you to identify whether consumers have more of a motivation to compare and evaluate, or more of a motivation to move on with things, right? And that dictionary has proven very versatile for me in the past. Now, this is as one example of a dictionary. So there's many different dictionaries, but as one example of a dictionary, this is what it looks like. So this one has 34 words for each construct, right? So if the consumer has a high locomotion orientation, that means they like to move on with things, they like to get going, they're maybe somewhat impatient, right? And if they read or write words such as act, do it, fast, go, get, move, momentum, make, right? That would indicate that they have such an inclination, right? And then there's 34 additional words such as critical, judgment, methodical, thinking, right, regret, reflect, right? They would indicate that consumers may be more, or people more generally, may be more interested in comparing and evaluating, right? And so the way that this software works is that you may, for instance, have a post like this, and the software finds, okay, there's one word from this dictionary, there's one word from the other dictionary, and then it will tell you what's the percentage of those words and generate a score then that you can use as a variable in your model. Now there's lots of different dictionaries, as I already highlighted. So there's at least 70 different dictionaries, right? And so you can see, for instance, here, there's this nice big PDF which was created that highlights all the dictionaries and the words contained in each dictionary, right? So there's a dictionary for swear words, for instance, right? I won't name every single word in the dictionary now, right? But you can see if what the literature suggests is if they use a lot of the words in here, right, they may have an inclination towards being narcissistic, right? So, so there's psychological correlates of these dictionaries that then allow you to assign meaning to the posts that you can find on social media, right? And there's other additional great resources such as this paper. It's a little old now, it's 12 years old, but from when it was published, it highlights like, it has this nice table in the appendix, right? Which highlights, okay, which type of words are there? These personal pronouns, for instance. It highlights what it means, right? Personal pronouns such as I, them, itself. They highlight that something is informal and personal. And then it gives you a list of articles that were written about this specific construct, right? So I see, again, large number of posts. Right. So I think there's no issue with my sound or something. So I can address all of these in the end, right? So again, you can study swear words. To my disappointments, I found that brands don't swear a lot on social media, but there's many other dictionaries that can be used, right? So using LIWC is as simple as just following the steps on the slide, right? So you click analyze text, you upload a CSV file that you just got from CrowdTangle, you select the message, right? And then it will look for words such as, for instance, in this context, drive, right? And then drive is a locomotion word. So this would indicate that locomotion is part of the dictionary. Now, one thing that is important to highlight here, though, is that everything needs to be interpreted very carefully, right? So if this is a data set from Volkswagen, drive may mean something very differently than what is anticipated in the original development of the dictionary, right? So everything needs to be evaluated and understood in context. Again, text data has its own caveats, right? So there's dictionaries that are often developed in different disciplines, not necessarily for social media research. And they may be, for instance, be developed for very long texts, such as movie scripts or letters to the investors that CEOs write, right? So these may be unsuitable for your data. And just to provide an example, the word yield, for instance, if it appears in an investment document, it may either not occur in social media in your data set at all, right? Which means that you don't have a variable, or you don't have a variable with many useful observations. Or it may mean something that is completely different, right? So we found that, for instance, in the past with the word right? Like being right means something very different than having civil rights, right? Now, another thing that is important to highlight is that a lot of this data is based on count variables, and count variables have this a nasty thing about them, that they don't always distribute normally, right? So non-normal distributions can make analysis difficult, right? Things that you learned through your PhD coursework, they may not apply, and you may need to look for alternative analysis methods, right? And just to provide you with one example, here I have a table of 1,000 locomotion observations. I cut it off in the middle, but what you can see is that 61% of the observations are 0, right? And then until 99, it goes only up to 10. But from 10, there's still observations that have a 20% locomotion observation, right? So it's highly peaked with a long tail to the right. And the same or even worse is true when you look at your shares data, right? So your shares data is typically not normally distributed, right? And the slide wasn't even big enough to kind of illustrate this well, but you can see here that with 1,000 shares, there were 80 posts that were not a single time shared, right? And then at the very end, there was one post that was 600 times shared, right? So you can see how based on that, you can create or have problems with existing methods, right? So you need to think a little bit, right? You may need to again turn to R, to turn to non-standard analyses, right? In order to make good sense of your data. Now, the last thing that I would like to highlight, sorry, was there somebody? No, okay. The last thing that I would like.
Hold on, just 1 second.
Right, so there was somebody who said something. If everybody could please mute themselves. The last thing that I would like to briefly talk about is the idea of image analysis. So this is something that has more recently come up. I think there's a lot of interest on this in the literature, right? And people really want to understand what are the effects of posting images with certain versus other content, right? And there's definitely established tools in order to get a good understanding of that, right? We haven't yet fully been able to make the technology work, but you can see if you upload a picture to Google Cloud Vision API, right? It will tell you what's in the picture, right? This one is outerwear and gestures and entertainment and pink, right? And you could see how you could derive different variables from that and then feed that back into your data set to build statistical models, right? And there's already really innovative authors who have been working on this. Now, as a next step, I would like to relatively briefly just highlight how we and teams have used such unstructured textual social media data in order to publish papers, right? So one thing that I would like to highlight in case somebody here is in a position to be hiring, right? So both of these are my PhD students, recently graduated, right? So feel free to help out, right? But anyway, let's start with the first paper. The first paper is titled Regulatory Focus Mode Fit Impacts Variety Seeking. And in order to understand the paper better, it helps to understand a little bit about the theory that we used across both papers, right? So there's basically two key theories that I use across my research, but by no means limited to these kind of research, these kind of theories if you like to do social media research. But in order to understand the paper, it helps to understand that we looked at regulatory focus, which speaks to consumers' motivations for safety and security as prevention orientations, or promotion orientations as growth and achievement, right? And so we can think about these almost like different personalities, right? So my mom, for instance, is a big prevention oriented person. Everything has to be safe and secure. She has 5 insurances for everything, right? My son, on the other hand, is more promotion oriented, right? He runs into things, does dangerous things, gets into trouble, right? These constructs can be operationalized with social media data as well as other instruments. And then there's regulatory mode theory. So regulatory mode theory, again, introduces 2 motivations, right? So it introduces assessment motivation, which is a motivation to think, compare, and evaluate, right? So you want to do the right thing, right? And then there's the locomotion orientation, which is a motivation to kind of just do it. These people, they want to move on, they want to control things, they want to change things, right? So as an example, I am a locomotion-oriented person, right? If I see somebody standing at a stoplight and I know that person has pressed on the button, I have to press again, right? If I'm waiting for the elevator and it doesn't come enough, I will press the button until it comes, right? So that is a locomotion-motivated person. Now, these constructs, they can be measured in established ways, right? So we have a scale, for instance. We can ask people, I am a doer, strongly disagree to agree, right? And if you strongly agree to that, you're probably a person like me that can stop to press the stoplight button, right? We can also temporarily activate these through primes, right? So we can ask people, for instance, to write about a time when they acted like a doer, they write their little essay, and after that they feel a little bit like a doer, right? Or we can give them an advertisement that makes them kind of want to just do it, like a Nike advertisement, for instance. And then finally, there's dictionaries, right? These have been developed more recently, and they allow for social media analysis. So if somebody reads or writes words such as do, act, and go long enough and for enough time, we can assume, or we can at least make inferences that they would have a high locomotion orientation, right? So it's a little bit like watching somebody who's really nervous, right? If you watch them for long enough, if people watch me long enough, press the stop button, right? They become a little bit of a locomotor themselves. For the first paper, what we wanted to do is to look at how these different motivations interact to predict variety seeking. So variety seeking refers to a consumer's tendency to diversify choices over time or within one purchase, right? So if a consumer seeks a lot of variety, right, that means that they like these kind of yogurts where there's 4 different flavors in one package, right? Or they like to press the shuffle button when they listen to Spotify, right? If somebody's low in variety seeking, what they do is they do kind of what I do. They listen to the same song on repeat for 8 hours, right? That's low variety seeking. Now, our idea was that when people have a certain prevention orientation relative to promotion, and they have an assessment orientation, and these together would affect in predicting people's choice behavior in terms of variety, right? So together, these motivations affect how much variety people want, right? So to the variety-seeking literature, this is relatively new because the interaction of 2 consumer traits hadn't really been studied, right? So this was really something new from that perspective. The second contribution that we had was that really these 2 motivations and how they interact with one another hadn't really been studied either, right? So nobody really had looked at how the idea of assessment and prevention, how they work together and can affect outcomes in a unique way through their combination, right? So this was something that we studied in this paper, and relevant to the first or to the point of today's talk, we analyzed review data, or more accurately, my PhD student analyzed review data from a social media music platform, and we found that prevention and assessment together, they affect variety seeking with regards to which artists people choose, right? So they listen to the same artist over and over again, or which genres that they choose, right? And we found this using Spotify and Apple music listening behavior, right? So this is kind of the real the big data set from this that we analyzed from this. And we have an example review here. This was something that I wrote, not something from the platform itself, but if there's, for instance, an assessment word such as avoid and a prevention word such as a regret, right? Then these words together, they may lead to a certain outcome, or they may be predictive together of a certain outcome in terms of listening behavior subsequently. Now we, of course, this sort of correlational review data, correlation isn't causation. There's many limitations with this. We don't really know why it happens, right? And as a consequence, we presented 4 additional studies, right? So we activated locomotion and assessment. We measured it through established primes, right? And we built a psychological mechanism that we tested through mediation. So we found that this effect was driven through engagement and attitude certainty, and that in turn affected variety seeking across a variety of product contexts, right? But the real key, what I believe drove this paper to publication, was really the first large data set, right? That's really what made the project unique. Now, there were a number of implications that we could draw from this, right? So if you want to have new products, right? Something that somebody likes who seeks variety, there may be a specific consumer segment for that. If you're an incumbent, an established player, you may want to target consumers that don't like to seek variety. And it may also be relevant for how to promote specific products, right? So you may want to use certain texts with different orientations when you promote a product that is that has all the same contents, right? So this time, this box has kind of like 20 times the same chocolate, and this is more like an assorted box with 20 different types of chocolates, right? So this is where this plays. But you can basically build implications that highlight specifically to managers already which kind of words they should be using in certain promotional activities. Now, in the second project that we wanted to look at, we wanted to understand what predicts the sharing of political tweets, right? So we downloaded everything that the United States Republican Party had ever said, so Trump's party, right? And then everything that the US Democrat Party had ever said, so Joe Biden's party, right? And the background behind this is really that political parties and candidates need engagement, but know little about like what really drives engagement with their content, right? So we know that that a successful social media campaign can have a really a big and important influence on political election outcomes, but we don't know really what they should be doing, right? So previous research also in social media had looked at specific goals that people were pursuing, but not really preferences for how to pursue those goals, right? Such as, for instance, achieving your goals through doing the right thing in terms of assessment orientation. So this is really what we wanted to test, right? And I believe what helps you here, this is a standard a conceptual model, as you would see it in many different quantitative articles. But the second graph highlights how it relates to a single data set that we were able to get from Twitter, right? So through sampling, we downloaded, or through purposefully sampling, we downloaded the accounts of the US Democrats and the US Republicans. We got 55,000 tweets from that, right? Then we scored those tweets using software to derive the locomotion and assessment orientations, right? So the words such as truth, go, and get they're all in the dictionary, right? So we saw variability with regards to the language of assessment and locomotion. Then based on the time of when it was posted, we were able to derive when the political party was in power. So we were able to study whether effects are stronger when they're in opposition versus when they're in power, right? And then as an outcome variable, as kind of highlighted in the contribution section, we wanted to study retweets as a way of looking at political engagement. So this single tweet kind of contains all the variables in a way. Now, the implications from this that we could derive was that assessment-oriented language spreads further, and overall, we found that Republicans had more assessment-oriented language, and the effect of assessment-oriented language was especially positive when the given party was in a position. So when they were not controlling the political, executive, and legislative, right? So you can see how being in opposition perhaps helps you to say more outrageous things on Twitter, right? And as a consequence, that can help you to go viral. Now, this was my brief tutorial on social media data analysis, plus 2 papers that I developed based on that. And I know that there have been a lot of questions, so I'm open to answer those now.
So the first one that came through, Frank, was what rationale do you provide your ethics committee to get your research projects approved? In the Australian National Human Research Statement, social media data generated by public profiles is not seen in the same way as news media. For example, looking forward to your views on this.
So we were able actually for most of these to get an ethics exemption. So I don't remember exactly the wording of our ethics application, but we didn't have to go through full ethics review because we were only collecting, you can think of it as archival data. The data exists already. We don't actively engage with participants. We don't reach out to them. And the consumer data that we have is all public. And it's merely count-based, right? So we don't have any consumer comments. We largely work with posts that are made by individual brand managers, and we wouldn't even know who they are, right? So somebody who manages the account of the US Republicans versus Democrats.
Awesome. So related to the previous question, will CrowdTangle include posts made in private Facebook groups?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm actually for reasons that are unrelated to ethics, I haven't even looked at groups much. And the reason behind that is it is just a lot easier in terms of how clean the data comes from a professionally managed Facebook account, right? So you need to have a lot more skills when it comes to cleaning the data. You need to have a lot more skills when it comes to interpreting what it means, right? If somebody shares something that an individual consumer says in a group, is that good or bad for the brand, right? So as a consequence, I haven't, I personally don't think that's where the best data lies, but I think that's somewhat subjective. There may be other people who really like this consumer-generated text data.
Okay, and on the topic of CrowdTangle, does CrowdTangle provide longitudinal data? For example, how many likes or comments for a post that change over time, or just all the posts in the past, you know, for example, 5 years and their total likes and comments at the point when the data is collected?
The second one. So you don't know when the likes were given. That would make the data set a lot more complicated. So in the past, we've sometimes thought, oh, what if we could actually download not just tweets, but comments to those tweets? But it's always been very complicated to go over that, because you get, the data set gets just a lot more complicated if you do that.
The next question was, how do you go about creating the dictionary for text analysis?
So you can actually, you can do that yourself. So if you, so Luke essentially allows you to build custom dictionaries just by manipulating individual Excel files. You can, I think the simplest way would be, what I would encourage would be to download the regulatory mode dictionary, right? So there's online sources that have that dictionary. And then you that dictionary will come to you, I think, either as as some sort of Excel file, I think a CSV, right? And it highlights a locomotion, right? And then all the words and the word stems, right? So a word stem is move, is a word stem for movement, moving, etc., right? And you can just manipulate the file in such a way that it will give you a completely different dictionary, right? So you can, for instance, look at a news outlet, and when if you sample that, then you could look at all different brands that they mentioned and build a custom-made dictionary for that.
And then the last question we've got in the comments is, could you please throw some could you please throw light on extracting and analyzing YouTube comments as a data set?
I'd actually have to refer to one of my PhD students to that. I haven't done that yet myself. We have done that in the past where we had Facebook data and Twitter data and wanted to really put the cherry on the cake and put YouTube on top. But YouTube, as far as I remember, they provide largely only views data, right? And they, I mean, when you go on YouTube, the most important thing is the video, right? And we haven't really, or I haven't really been able to analyze video data because that's a lot more complicated, right? So I can speak to that in detail.
No, that's okay. Sort of off the back of that, have you done any work with high or low fidelity synthetic data? Does that provide any better insights with getting sensitive data as well?
No, I've not heard of some of those terms.
And the comments are still coming through. So could you please talk about analyzing Reddit comments?
I haven't done that either. No, so far, so I've supervised projects where we looked, or I've collaborated on projects where we looked at Kickstarter as well. That was really nice because the dependent variable is actual money. And we had this other customized review data set that we had there. So reviews and social media posts, they are some of the more common ones. Of course, Reddit is social media, but the way that I look at it, if it doesn't, I know that you can upvote and downvote on Reddit. But other than that, I wouldn't see the big advantage, and it's mostly consumer generated data that you find there, right? So it's not, I'm not saying that it's not interesting, but it's not necessarily in my focus.
I might also even flag another one of our colleagues as well, Naomi Moy, who is a PhD student. She did analysis on crowdfunding as well. And I think her master's thesis was around the communications to success with decision-making and crowdfunding. So that might have some information on the comments as well, if you wanted to look that up.
Yeah, Naomi and me are collaborators. We have two papers in the review. Yeah, so
so there's a few more coming through as well, Frank. Sorry. Okay, these are more just comments about previous comments about creating dictionaries. Did anyone want to take the opportunity to unmute themselves and ask a question as well? Maybe. What of analyzing both posts of channels and the associated comments?
So I think that speaks to some degree what we talked about before. So if you have a post and a comment, right? You typically have, say, hundreds of posts and a variable number of comments per post. So that is a level of complication with the analysis that I haven't really been like. It's very complicated, and I don't necessarily see the urge to do that right away, right? So I see how you could potentially find interesting questions with it, but I think with the existing methods that I found that useful enough, right, to answer some questions.
Alrighty. Well, thank you very much for your talk, Frank. If there's not any more questions in the meantime.
Right, so anybody wants to unmute and say something? Have any questions? Happy for anybody to reach out to me via email as well.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to say a big thank you, Frank, for coming along this afternoon. And thank you also, Sam, for arranging all the technical side of things. I think that we really have started off with some really interesting discussions here. And I really do believe that this is an area that we're all, that a lot of people are interested in and can really see legs, I suppose, for research. And I think you highlighted a really interesting point at the beginning with the challenges around funding, and this data is all just sitting there. And it's a nice way to complement some of the other studies that we do. So I think some of the discussions that we've just seen coming through in the feed also indicates that there is a lot of other people who are working in this space. So if anybody wants to reach out to Frank, but also some of the names that have coming up before, if you want to work to reach out to each other, I think that's a really good starting point for everything. So I'd like to say thank you very much, Frank, for everything. And looking at the comments that are coming through, Frank, you've been a hit for everything as well. So thank you for a Friday afternoon. And thank you very much for everyone for coming along today. And to hear Frank's thoughts. And I do apologise, Frank, for the scope that the interest definitely took a life of its own, but it did really show the interest that everybody has in this research area.
Yeah.
So I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful weekend and enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon.